Our first presentation is from Jane Daniels, Professor of Clinical Trials at the University of Nottingham and Deputy Director of the Nottingham Clinical Trials Unit. Jane's main research interest is in the production of high-quality evidence for healthcare interventions across the spectrum of women's health. She's led and been involved in many of the UK's largest women's health trials. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Candice. Could I move the slide on, please? Thank you. So, heavy periods are a substantial problem for women, especially when periods first start or in the lead up to menopause. Many women and girls don't like talking about their periods, or they believe nothing can be done, or don't realise that their bleeding is not normal. I mean, it shouldn't be that you should be doubling up on tampons and towels or unable to plan everyday activities. And whilst attitudes are changing, there is an unmet need for treatments for heavy periods. Now, there are known gynecological causes of heavy bleeding, including endometriosis and fibroids, and these can be identified by doctors through examination, scans, or tests. However, there are also many women for whom there is no apparent cause for their heavy bleeding, and that's the group I'll be mostly talking about today in this session. Treatments available are hormones, which are also contraceptives, non-hormonal medicines, which are obviously more appropriate for those hoping to get pregnant, and surgical procedures such as endometrial ablation and hysterectomy, and they're appropriate if medical treatments are not suitable or not working. Which medical treatment should be offered first was the focus of the ECLIPSE trial. Okay, next slide. So the ECLIPSE trial recruited a representative sample of women with heavy periods and no obvious cause for their bleeding, and also who were not wanting to get pregnant. They were recruited from a primary care population over a time frame that straddled the first NICE guidelines on heavy menstrual bleeding. They were randomly allocated to two groups, either to have a contraceptive coil, which is also known as the levonorgestrel IUS or LNG IUS, or by brand names such as Mirena, or else they were allocated to an oral medicine, which could be a hormonal or non-hormonal drug, depending on their choice or their contraceptive requirements. At intervals, we asked the participants to complete a questionnaire that asked about the impact of their bleeding on aspects of their life. And that produced a score on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 was severely affected and 100 not at all. Now, we reported the 2-year follow-up of these participants in 2013, where we showed that whilst both groups significantly improved from their baseline score, we saw that there was a 13-point difference in favour of the coil, which was both statistically and clinically important. We continued with that follow-up of the trial and the participants to 5 years, at which point the time point had shrunk. It was only 4 points different and no longer significant. So next slide, please. There are no longer-term data on the use of either class of treatment, so the ECLIPSE trial presented an opportunity to carry on collecting information. But we had a shift in focus to how many women are still using their allocated treatment or chose to change treatments or opted for surgery. We'd also earlier explored the experience of women and the reasons behind their treatment choices, and so we wanted to repeat this aspect of the study. Participants, when they started, were on average 42 years old, so most would be perimenopausal after 10 years and therefore able to reflect on their kind of menstrual journey. Of the original 571 women, 490 were available for reapproach at around 10 years, but unfortunately about half of those were untraceable. Ultimately, 206 original participants agreed and provided more information at around this 10-year time point, and they did not appear to differ in characteristics from those that we couldn't contact or the non-responders. And also from this group, we saw interviews from a cross-section of participants. Okay, next slide. Between 5 and 10 years of follow-up, a substantial proportion of women, 89 or 43%, reported not taking any treatments for their heavy periods. A similar proportion were still using the coil, and the proportions that were still using their initial treatment were much higher for those initially allocated the coil from the medical treatment, the oral medical treatment group. And I guess this reflects earlier findings at the 2 and 5 year mark, that those allocated the coil did tend to stick with it, partly through choice, perhaps because it was more effective, and also, of course, reflective of the fact it takes a doctor's appointment to remove the coil, whereas anyone can stop taking oral medication. About 3 in 10 women reported that they had had a surgical procedure for their bleeding, slightly more, but not significantly more, in the oral medical treatment group. Next slide, please. Now, given the number of women at 10 years follow-up that we knew would be peri or postmenopausal, we didn't really want to focus on the original period-specific questionnaire, but instead use a more kind of general quality of life questionnaire, and which we'd used throughout. And that showed that the improvement from pre-randomization at the beginning, that had also improved through 2 and 5 years, was sustained at 10 years. But there was not actually a difference between the original allocated groups in this general quality of life score. Okay, next slide. When it comes to the data coming from the interviews, we don't tend to try and put numbers on the information received, but we try to seek out themes and what people are saying. So one theme that came out was that the quality of interaction with healthcare professionals was important. And many reported a positive experience with their contact with their doctors because they felt informed and involved in their treatment decisions. When they reflected upon other factors and motivations that impacted on their choice of initial treatment, it's apparent that those choices do change in relation to the life stage. So they might change whether they're actively trying for a baby, whether we're requiring a reliable contraception, or whether they considered that they were approaching menopause. When it came to thinking about surgical choices, there was consideration about the invasiveness of the procedures on offer and how long recovery might be. There were comments, though, that showed a misunderstanding of a hysterectomy, that it would induce kind of automatic menopause, whereas when the womb is removed for heavy bleeding, usually the ovaries are not also removed. And we also heard that friends and family can influence treatment choice, but it's also apparent that clear and reliable online resources would be welcome. So to summarise in the final slide, there are treatments that exist that are useful for those both with contraceptive needs and those seeking to get pregnant, although the superiority of the coil over oral treatments and heavy bleeding was not sustained at 5 years. The impact of the overall quality of life of initial treatment was maintained up to 10 years and should be highlighted. We see that surgery is not inevitable. 3 out of 10 had a procedure, although perhaps slightly more with oral treatment. And what can we do? Both society and healthcare professionals need to normalise discussion about periods and emphasise that it's not just a period, and the heavy bleeding can be treated. And in doing so, we need to clarify that heavy periods do not mean that there isn't necessarily an underlying cause. They can just happen. And doctors can offer tests and scans to see if there is also a gynecological reason that can be treated. Furthermore, in reflecting changes in women's healthcare needs over the menstrual life course, treatments can be changed and tailored. Follow-up time points, such as when the coil gets changed, are opportunities to discuss symptoms and desires, as could other appointments with sexual or reproductive healthcare providers. The most important thing is that these encounters are patient-centred and involve shared decision-making, hopefully using the information derived from the ECLIPSE trial and other research. Thank you.